For 400 years, the most powerful commercial force in Northern Europe had no capital city, no standing army, no head of state, no treasury. It did not even have a common seal, and it never wrote down who its members were. Historians have looked, and there is no list, because no one ever made one. It could starve a kingdom into signing a treaty. It could not compel a single one of its own towns to do anything at all. The picture most of us carry is a warm one. Stepped gables along a gray waterfront. Men in fur-trimmed coats who kept their word because keeping your word was simply what a Hanse man did. A brotherhood of German trading towns, bound by oath and common interest, holding together for 4 centuries because its members trusted one another. That picture explains the Hanseatic League by character. It says the thing worked because these were disciplined, loyal, unusually reliable men. And when the story reaches the 16th century, the same picture explains the ending the same way that their descendants grew comfortable, conservative, slow. Here is the small detail that picture cannot hold. At the height of it, in the second half of the 14th century, a town's delegates could sit through the debate at a general assembly and then walk out of the room before the vote was taken. A decision did not bind a town whose representative was absent. Leaving early was not a betrayal, and nobody treated it as one. It was a procedure. It was not a state, and it was not a brotherhood. It was a cartel, and its only weapon was the collective refusal to trade. Not a cartel loosely, in the way people reach for the word to make something sound sinister. A cartel, exactly. A group of independent sellers who agree to act as one in order to hold a price and hold a privilege, with no authority above them capable of making anyone comply. There was no Hanseatic army. There was no Hanseatic capital. There was no Hanseatic law, no Hanseatic court, no Hanseatic treasury, and for most of its life, no permanent officials of any kind, nothing but an assembly that met when someone convened one. The historian Philippe Dollinger, who spent a career on this, called it an inorganic entity with an almost intangible structure, and pointed out that it had puzzled the lawyers of its own century, who could not work out what category of thing they were dealing with. He disliked the word league so much that he proposed dropping it and calling the whole phenomenon a community instead. That is not a pedantic quarrel about vocabulary. The fact that 400 years of scholarship cannot settle on a noun is the first real piece of evidence about what this was. Institutions that leave clean definitions behind leave charters, seals, and rolls of membership. This one left ledgers and complaints. So the question is not how a merchant republic ran the Baltic. The question is how a group of towns with no coercive power over each other and no coercive power over anyone else spent roughly 2 centuries dictating terms to kings. The answer is a number, and once you see it, almost everything else about the Hanse stops sounding like character and starts sounding like consequence. The privileges, the closed compounds, the oaths, the strange discipline, and eventually the disappearance. All of it downstream of one constraint that had nothing to do with who these people were. There is no court at the other end. Start on a ship, somewhere off the Danish coast, in the last decade of the 13th century. The hold is full of barrels. Salted herring, packed in Scanian salt, bound for a market several hundred miles from the town that owns them. The vessel is a cog, flat-bottomed, single-masted, the workhorse of the northern seas. Vessels of this type ranged widely in size. One recovered from the Weser and dated to around 1,380 could carry something on the order of 130 tons, though specialists still argue over the figure. Whatever the exact number, it is a great deal of fish. And that is the problem. A barrel of salted herring is worth very little. Its value comes almost entirely from the fact that a lot of it has been moved cheaply. Nobody is getting rich on any single barrel. The margin lives in volume, in a full hold, in a season where you make the crossing and nothing goes wrong. Now watch what something goes wrong means. The lord whose coastline you are passing decides there is a new toll. Not a large one. It does not have to be large. On a cargo whose worth per ton is this low, a modest toll takes the entire profit of the voyage, and you have no way to refuse it, because the alternative to paying is not sailing, or you run aground. Under the wreck law that operated on much of the northern European coast, goods that came ashore from a foundered ship belonged to whoever held the shore. Not the merchant, not his heirs, the local power. Your ship touches a sandbank and your cargo legally becomes somebody else's property while you are still standing on the beach watching it. Or nothing dramatic happens at all. You arrive at the far port, you sell, and the buyer does not pay. Or he pays in coin that is worth less than it says. Or the town's own merchants have persuaded their council to make foreigners sell only through a local intermediary at a price the local intermediary sets. Now go and complain. To whom? You are a burgher of Lübeck standing in Bruges, or in Bergen, or 400 miles up a Russian river at Novgorod. Your town's council has no authority here. Your bishop has none. There is no king who is yours in any sense that this place recognizes. The court in this town is the town's court, staffed by the town's men, applying the town's law to a stranger who will be gone by winter and whose absence will cost them nothing. You are not without rights, because the age is lawless. The age is full of law. You are without rights because law in the 13th century runs along the lines of who you belong to, and 400 miles from home, you belong to nobody. Put those two facts side by side, and you have the constraint. The cargo is too cheap to defend, and you are too far from home to sue. That is what it costs to trade goods with low value per ton across a border where you have no standing. Every barrel of herring, every load of Baltic timber, every sack of Prussian grain, every bale of Russian furs carries an invisible surcharge. The risk that somewhere along the route, someone with local authority will simply take a piece of it, and there will be no forum in which that can be contested. Solve that, and you do not merely improve a trade route. You unlock an entire category of commerce that cannot otherwise exist. Bulk goods only make money at scale, and scale is exactly what you cannot risk when any single voyage can be confiscated at the far end by somebody having a bad month. There is no court at the other end. Everything the Hanse ever built was an answer to that sentence. The towns of the Baltic coast were not the first to notice the problem. They were the first to notice where the solution had to be applied. The instinct then and now is to fix it at sea. Better ships, armed escorts, convoys. And the Hanse towns did all of that, on and off, with mixed success and a certain amount of embarrassment, since some of their own members spent the late 14th century quietly harboring the pirates, who were robbing everyone else's cargoes. But the merchants of Lübeck and the other Wendish towns along the southern Baltic Rostock, Wismar, Stralsund, Greifswald worked out something sharper. The choke point was not the water. The water was survivable. The choke point was the terms you could extract from the town at the far end. You cannot make a foreign court hear you, but you can make a foreign town agree, in writing, in advance, that you will not need its court. That is what a Hanseatic privilege actually was, and it is worth being precise about the contents, because the shape of the ask tells you what the constraint was. Exemption from local tolls and duties, so no lord can quietly tax away your margin. A defined quarter of the town that is yours, where your goods sit under your own lock. And the real prize internal jurisdiction, the right to settle disputes among your own merchants, under your own rules, administered by men you elect. Those compounds were called contours. The four great ones sat at the corners of the network: the Steel Yard in London, a walled compound of its own on the Thames; Bruges, the gateway to Flemish cloth and the wider Western economy; Bergen, the outlet for the dried cod of northern Norway; and Novgorod, deep inside Rus, the source of furs and wax. Each ran itself, electing its own alderman. The London compound eventually built an electoral system that forced voters to pick candidates from different regions, because the alternative was factions. And each ran a rulebook governing the men inside it. At Novgorod, the rules were called the Shra, and they were the strictest of the four. The alderman there held a more absolute authority than his counterparts elsewhere, and the code reached well past commerce into private life. A merchant could not settle in the town permanently. He could not marry a local woman. Breaking those rules could cost him his place in the trade entirely. Read quickly. That looks like clannishness. Hold on to it. It is not. So far, this is just a set of contracts. Contracts are worth what the enforcement behind them is worth, and the enforcement behind these was the whole trick. When a town or a prince broke the terms, the network stopped arriving. Not a raid. Not a siege. An embargo total, coordinated, and aimed at the one thing a late medieval commercial town could not replace on short notice. The clearest demonstration came at Bruges. In 1358, the Flemish authorities moved to raise the burden on Hanseatic merchants, and the assembly voted to withdraw. Every Hanse merchant was to be out of Flanders by the 1st of May. The contour physically relocated to Dordrecht, in Holland. Ships had to carry certificates proving they had not come from Flanders, and any merchant caught trading there faced permanent exclusion from Hanseatic privileges, which meant losing access to every other port in the network at once. Flemish cloth production, which depended on inputs, the withdrawal cutoff, collapsed. In 1360, Bruges conceded everything. They ran that play repeatedly across the 14th and 15th centuries against Flanders in 1307, again in 1358, again in 1388, again in the 1430s, and it worked every single time. Each round ended with the privileges not merely restored but extended. And what the internal law of this network chiefly protected tells you what the asset really was. In 1385, the London Contour expelled a merchant named Christian Kelmer. His offense was not fraud, or theft, or violence. He had paid an export duty that Hanseatic merchants were exempt from. He paid a tax. That was the crime. Because a privilege that one member declines to use is a privilege the host town will start asking everyone else to decline. Follow one barrel, and the machine becomes visible. It starts, oddly, not with fish, but with salt inland, at Lüneburg, in northern Germany, where brine has been worked since long before any of this. Salt from Lüneburg goes overland and down the Elbe to Hamburg, and from Hamburg by sea. In the accounts kept at Lübeck for 1368 and 1369, roughly a third of all the Lüneburg salt, passing through somewhere between 20 and 24,000 barrels of it, was going to one destination. That destination was a beach. Every late summer, on the Scanian shore at the mouth of the Baltic, the herring arrived in numbers that are difficult to picture, and a temporary town assembled itself on the sand to process them. Booths, curing yards, coopers, ships standing offshore. Estimates of the catch run as high as 300,000 barrels in a season, though that figure comes from the enthusiast literature rather than a scholarly series, and should be held loosely. What is not in doubt is that for a few weeks a year, an empty peninsula became one of the busiest commercial sites in Europe, and then became an empty peninsula again. Now count the layers of the take. First, the salt. Herring rots. Herring in salt travels. The salt comes from a small number of places, and the network controls the route from the workings to the beach. Second, the fishing grounds themselves, and eventually the castles overlooking them. Third, the hull. Bulk cargo pays only if freight is cheap, and cheap freight is a fleet, not a ship. Fourth, and largest, the terms at the far end. The exempt quarter, the untaxed sale, the dispute settled under your own alderman instead of somebody else's. Every one of those four layers is a place to take a margin, and the same network holds all four. Run it forward to the year 1400, and look at what arrives in a single town. 550 ships came into Lübeck that year, carrying 65,000 barrels of salted herring. One town, 1 year, one commodity. Let that land. Lübeck was the largest of them, but it was one of 70 or so towns in the core of this thing, with perhaps another 130 attached to it more loosely, and nobody, then or since, has been able to produce a definitive membership list, because no such list was ever compiled. In modern terms, this was never really a trading business. It was a logistics business with a regulatory moat, and the moat was worth more than the freight, which is why the political achievements of the network read so strangely. By 1370, after a war with Denmark, the terms the towns extracted at Stralsund included free passage of the Sound, possession of 4 Scanian castles, Malmö, Helsingborg, Skanör and Falsterbo, and 2/3 of the revenues of the Scanian markets and fisheries, all of it for 15 years. The old wreck law was abolished outright, and the towns took a veto over candidates for the Danish throne, merchants, holding a veto on who gets to be king. And look closely at the shape of what they took, because it is not what a conquering power takes. They did not annex Scania, they did not install a governor, or claim the land, or ask anyone to swear anything to them. They took the castles that overlooked the fishing grounds. They took 2/3 of what the fairs and fisheries produced. And they took it on a 15-year clock, after which, by the terms of their own treaty, it went back. That is not a territorial ambition. That is a lien. They wanted the revenue stream and the physical control of the point where the revenue was collected for a defined period, and nothing else, because everything else, the province, the population, the obligation to govern and defend it, was cost. A state at that moment of advantage takes the land. These men took the toll booth and left. They did not take that with an army they owned. Ships and men for that war came from individual towns under a specific agreement, negotiated at Cologne in 1367, where the deputies of 77 towns assigned quotas, and where Bremen and Hamburg, worn out by earlier fighting, declined to send military support at all and paid money instead, while the inland and Westphalian towns contributed nothing. The United Front arrived with a schedule of exemptions attached. None of this works unless somebody, somewhere, cannot walk away. Go north, to Bergen, on the Norwegian coast. The contour there was established as a formal Hanseatic post around the middle of the 14th century, But German merchants had been working the port for far longer, and what they were working was a very narrow exchange. Out of northern Norway came stockfish cod, split and dried in cold air until it is hard as board and will keep for years. Into northern Norway came grain. It came in because it could not be grown there. Above a certain latitude on that coastline, the growing season will not carry a population. And by the high Middle Ages there was a population, living on fish and on bread made from flour that arrived by sea. That is not a trade relationship. That is a dependency. And everyone involved understood it as one. And it ran in both directions at once, which is the part that does the damage. For centuries, the German merchants held the export monopoly on northern Norwegian stockfish. They were the route by which that fish reached European markets. And there was no other. They were also the source of the grain coming back. Set those two facts against a single household on that coastline and see what it produces. The fish they catch has one buyer, the bread they eat has one seller, and the buyer and the seller are the same men, quoting both numbers, in the same conversation, at the same quayside. There is no price negotiation available in that position. There is only the ratio those men choose to offer between a barrel of dried cod and a barrel of rye, and the answer to a bad ratio is not to go elsewhere, because there is no elsewhere. It is to catch more fish. In 1284, after German merchants at Bergen felt themselves mistreated and a crowd attacked one of their ships, representatives of the Wendish towns met at Wismar and agreed on a response. They would send no grain to Norway, no flour, no malt, no beer. And then they simply did not sail. There was a general famine. Not a shortage, not hardship in the trading records hunger, across a kingdom, engineered deliberately by men in a meeting hall 600 miles away, as a negotiating position. The following year, the Norwegian crown capitulated, paid damages for the original incident, and granted the German merchants privileges that would shape that coastline for centuries. This is the mechanism, seen without any of its furniture. Strip away the gables and the oaths and the fur collars, and what the Hanseatic towns possessed was the capacity to decide that a region would not eat this year. It is worth being exact about who paid. Not the king, particularly. Not the officials who had mishandled the original dispute. The cost landed on households along a coastline who had no representation in the quarrel, no knowledge of it, and no capacity to affect its outcome. The standard position of the party who pays for a cartel action, then and now. They were not a party to the negotiation. They were the leverage. And there is one more thing about 1284 that matters more than it looks. The embargo was not complete. Bremen kept trading. English harbors did what they could to keep Bergen supplied. The very first time this weapon was fired, the founding demonstration, the one that established what these towns could do to a kingdom, a member was already selling around it, and there was no mechanism to stop him. Now take back the two accusations. The first was that they held together out of trust. 4 centuries of German merchant solidarity, oath-bound, unusually disciplined. They held together because leaving was expensive. That is the entire content of it. A merchant inside the network sold in exempt quarters, under his own law, at freight rates a fleet makes possible. A merchant outside it paid the tolls, used the local courts, and competed against men who did neither. The oaths were real, the rituals were real, the sense of common identity was real, and all of them sat on top of a calculation that came out the same way every year for a very long time. The solidarity was not producing the advantage. The advantage was producing the solidarity. The second accusation is the one about the ending. That they grew comfortable, that they became conservative, that a generation of merchants lost the appetite of their great-grandfathers. Nobody's character changed. A freight rate changed. And notice what the internal discipline was actually made of, because this is where the character story falls apart completely. The network had exactly one punishment exclusion. An exclusion is not a sanction at all. It is a comparison. It hurts precisely as much as the outside world is worse than the inside world, and not 1 unit more. For 150 years, the outside world was worse, so exclusion was terrifying, and everyone called that discipline. When the outside world stopped being worse, the identical threat, spoken by the identical men in the identical hall, was worth nothing. Nothing about them had moved, which brings back the rulebooks. A code that forbids a merchant from settling permanently in the town he trades in, and forbids him from marrying a woman who lives there, looks from the outside like a closed people, keeping themselves apart, the least attractive reading available, and the one that gets reached for most often. It is a defection control. A merchant who settles becomes a resident. A merchant who marries into the town acquires a household there, then relatives, then obligations, then standing, and a man with standing in the local community no longer needs the compound, the alderman, or the network's protection, because he has become a person the local court will hear. He has solved his own problem, and the moment he solves it, he is a competitor with all of the network's knowledge and none of its costs. The rule was never about keeping foreigners out. It was about keeping members in. The strange procedures make sense in the same light. A delegate walking out before a vote is not a lapse in commitment. It is a rational hedge in a body that cannot compel its members, and everyone builds one. A town harboring pirates who prey on its own allies is not hypocrisy. It is a town collecting a private return from a public cost. And a network whose one weapon requires unanimity, but which possesses no means of obtaining unanimity, will do what the Hanse did in 1388, when the vote to re-embargo Flanders passed by a thin margin, carrying its most powerful instrument by a hair, because the men being asked to stop selling were the men who lost money by stopping. The constraint did not decide what any of these people chose. It decided which choices were on the table. Inside that space there were men who honored embargoes at real cost, and men who sold around them, towns that sent ships and towns that sent excuses, and those were genuine choices with genuine authors. Arithmetic sets the board. It does not move the pieces. There is no court at the other end. There never was one on the inside either. The machine stepped fully into the light in the 1470s, in a quarrel with England. The dispute ran through the late 1460s and into the early 1470s, and it was the familiar situation. English interests pressing on Hanseatic privileges, and the towns responding the way they always had, by shutting England out of the network's trade. The play required everyone to stop selling. It always had. Cologne did not stop selling. Cologne was a great city. Old in the trade, its merchants had held privileges in London since the middle of the 12th century, long before Lübeck existed as a power, and it had its own relationship with England, and its own view of the quarrel. So while the Wendish towns held the line, Cologne went on trading, and did well out of the absence of its colleagues. The response was the only response available. Around 1471, Cologne was expelled. And then watch what expulsion actually did. It did not stop Cologne trading. It did not seize anything. It did not remove Cologne's privileges in England, which were the whole point of the defection. It removed Cologne's access to the network's privileges elsewhere, which mattered exactly as much as those privileges were worth compared to what England was offering. And in 1471, that comparison was no longer obvious. Then, in 1474, the war ended at Utrecht, and Cologne was readmitted on stiff financial terms. That is the entire enforcement apparatus, performed in public, from beginning to end. A member breaks the cartel, profits by breaking it, is expelled, waits, and is taken back for money. Any member watching that sequence learned the price of defection, and the price was a fine and a delay. The arithmetic underneath had already turned. By 1475, close to a third of the ships docking at Danziger Hanse town, in the Hanse's own sea, were Dutch. The Dutch were curing fish more cheaply, salting catches aboard the vessel, and running their hulls at freight rates the Hanse could not match. Worse, they were sailing upriver to deal with inland towns directly, which removed the port middleman from the transaction, and the port middleman was the business. 19 years later, the other half of the mechanism failed, in the other direction. In 1494, Ivan III closed the contour at Novgorod, jailed the 49 Hanseatic merchants who were there, and seized their goods. They were held for years. Reports say those released died on the journey home. The network's answer to a hostile prince had always been to stop selling to him. Ivan did not need to buy. Against a consolidating territorial state, the weapon closed on nothing. And then the constraint itself, the one this entire structure existed to work around, began quietly dissolving, in the least dramatic way imaginable. Bruges had been silting up for years, and the commercial center of gravity in the Low Countries shifted to Antwerp. The Hanse did eventually open a contour there, by 1520, decades after the money had moved. But Antwerp was doing something the older ports had never done. From the middle of the 16th century, it developed a comprehensive commercial code, a public body of law, administered by the city, that applied to merchants as merchants, regardless of where they came from. A foreign trader in Antwerp did not need a walled compound, an elected alderman, or a rulebook forbidding him to marry, because he could take his dispute to the city's own court and be heard. There was a court at the other end, and the moment there was, the entire apparatus was overhead. The shape of this problem did not go away. Every cartel in recorded history has the same architecture. A group of sellers whose collective power is real, whose individual incentive is to quietly exceed the agreement, and who possess no authority capable of compelling one another. The power is entirely a function of compliance, and compliance is entirely voluntary. That is why the interesting question about any such arrangement is never how strong it looks from outside. It is what a member gains by cheating this quarter, and whether anyone can do anything about it. An oil cartel is the version most people have watched. The recurring story there is not confrontation with buyers. It is quota discipline among members, and whether the published numbers describe what is actually being pumped. Two places the comparison breaks, and both are instructive. A modern producer's cartel sells something that sits under specific ground. You cannot replicate the deposit by being cleverer or building a better ship. The Hanse was not selling a deposit. It was selling access to a route and terms at a destination, and a route can be sailed by anyone who turns up with a cheaper hull, which is precisely what happened. The moat was made of arrangements, and arrangements are copyable. The second break is sharper. A modern cartel has a secretariat, published quotas, and a membership list. The Hanse had none of the three. It could not enforce compliance, but more fundamentally, it could not measure it. There was no roster to check a name against, no agreed quota to exceed, no office-keeping count. A cartel that cannot tell you who its members are, cannot tell you who is cheating. Two things are true at once here, and the second one matters. The constraint was real. A merchant, 400 miles from home, genuinely had no forum. And the institutions these towns built to work around that absence were a serious piece of engineering, one that moved more grain, salt, timber, and fish across northern Europe than anything before it. That is not a small achievement, and it was not luck. And the men inside it were still making choices. Some kept embargoes that cost them money. Some sold around them. Some sent ships, and some sent regrets. The arithmetic told them what was possible, not what to do, and the difference between those two things is where the actual history lives. The end, when it came, was not a defeat. There is no siege, no treaty, no year to mark. The assembly simply met less and less. The last one convened in 1669, about 40 years after the previous one, and only a handful of towns bothered to send anyone. There was nothing to dissolve, because there had never been anything to dissolve. It had only ever been a standing agreement that stopped being worth keeping. And when it stopped being worth keeping, no announcement was required. Nothing held the Hanseatic League together, because for a century and a half, nothing had to. It was simply the cheapest thing in the northern seas to belong to, and the moment something cheaper came alongside, there was nothing there to hold. That is the price of a bargain with nobody to enforce it. Next time, the price of moving a thing that eats.